Mark Wahlberg had no idea that stopping at a small diner on the outskirts of Boston would change a man's life forever, or that it would leave everyone in the room wiping tears from their eyes. The morning had started like any other. Mark was in town for a few meetings, keeping a low profile, dressed in a plain hoodie and baseball cap. He wasn't in the mood for attention. All he wanted was a hot cup of coffee and a moment to clear his mind. But fate had other plans. As he stepped into the diner, the smell of fresh pancakes and sizzling bacon filled the air. A few patrons glanced his way, but no one seemed to recognize him. That was exactly how he liked it. He found a corner booth, took a seat, and was about to pull out his phone when something, or rather, someone, caught his eye. A man sat alone in the farthest booth, huddled in an old military jacket, his head bowed over a steaming cup of coffee. His clothes were worn, frayed at the edges, and his boots were caked with dirt. He looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. But what struck Mark the most wasn't the man's appearance. It was his eyes. There was something in them, something haunted, something familiar. Mark didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. He tried to focus on the menu, but his gaze kept drifting back. Something about the man gnawed at his mind, tugging at a distant memory he couldn't quite place. David Collins had once been a hero. He never thought his life would turn out like this. Alone, forgotten, invisible. 10 years ago, he was a decorated Marine, standing tall in his uniform as he received a medal for bravery. He had saved 3 fellow soldiers during an ambush in Afghanistan, dragging them to safety while bullets whizzed past his head. He had been hailed as a hero. He had shaken the hands of generals. He had received letters from the president. But medals didn't stop the nightmares, and no one told him how hard it would be when he came home. At first, things seemed okay. He had a wife who loved him, a daughter who adored him, and a home that was modest but comfortable. But the war had followed him back. Loud noises made him jump. Crowded places made him sweat. He had trouble sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the desert, hearing the screams of his brothers in arms. He tried to pretend he was fine, but the cracks started showing. His temper flared. He withdrew from his family. The drinking started, just a little at first, to take the edge off, to numb the memories. But soon, 1 drink became 2, then 3, then he stopped counting. His wife begged him to get help. He refused. "I'm fine," he'd say. "I don't need anyone's pity." Then one night, after a particularly bad argument, he stormed out of the house. He just needed some air, he told himself. He'd cool down, go back, make things right. But when he returned, the house was empty. His wife and daughter were gone. A note sat on the kitchen table. "I love you, but I can't do this anymore." He read it 100 times, hoping the words would change. They never did. From there, everything unraveled. He lost his job. His drinking got worse. Bills piled up, then eviction notices. Eventually, he found himself on the streets, sleeping under bridges, lining up for food at shelters, watching people cross the street to avoid him. And the worst part? He couldn't even blame them. He was ashamed of what he had become. Some nights, as he lay on a cardboard mat under an overpass, he wondered how it had all gone so wrong. He thought about his daughter, where she was, what she was doing, if she ever thought about him. He thought about calling his wife, but every time he reached for the last quarter in his pocket, fear stopped him. What if she didn't pick up? Worse, what if she did and told him never to call again? So he stayed silent. And now here he was, in a dingy little diner on the outskirts of Boston, clutching a cup of coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He hadn't eaten a full meal in days. His stomach was tight with hunger, but even tighter with shame. Then, just as the waitress set down a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, a voice cut through the quiet morning hum. "Hey, that guy's gonna stink up the whole place." Laughter followed. David's hands tightened around his fork. He didn't look up. He didn't react. He had learned long ago that it was better to stay silent, to let the insults roll off him like rain on a rooftop. But today was different. Because today, someone else wasn't going to let it slide. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen this man before. He tried to focus on the menu, but his eyes kept wandering back. There was something unsettlingly familiar about him, like a half-forgotten dream just out of reach, stirring a memory buried deep in Mark's mind. Then, just as Mark was about to shake it off, something happened that made his blood run cold. A waitress approached the man's table, setting down a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. The man hesitated before picking up his fork, his hands trembling slightly. But before he could take a bite, a voice cut through the quiet morning hum. "Hey, that guy's gonna stink up the whole place." Laughter followed. Mark turned sharply to see a group of young men, early 20s, dressed in designer jackets, loud and obnoxious. One of them scrunched up his nose dramatically, as if the very presence of the homeless man was offensive. Mark clenched his fists. The homeless man, who had been keeping his head down, froze. His fingers tightened around the fork, his knuckles white. He didn't look up. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, swallowing the humiliation like he'd done it 100 times before. Mark felt something boil inside him. He stood, moving before he could think twice about it. Within seconds, he was beside the man's booth. The young men fell silent as they recognized him. Their cocky expressions wavered. Mark placed a firm hand on the back of the booth and leaned slightly toward the homeless man. "Mind if I sit here?" The man blinked up at him, clearly caught off guard. He hesitated before giving a small nod. Mark slid into the seat across from him. The diner had gone completely quiet. "I'm Mark," he said, offering his hand. The man looked at him, unsure, before finally shaking it. "David," he said, his voice rough, like someone who hadn't spoken much in a long time. David Collins. That name. Mark knew that name. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Years ago, he had read an article about a Marine who had saved 3 of his fellow soldiers after an IED explosion in Afghanistan. The Marine had been awarded a medal for bravery. His name was David Collins. Mark's heart pounded. Could this really be the same man? And if so, how had he ended up here? Before Mark could ask, the same group of young men scoffed loudly. One of them muttered, "Wasting your time, man. He's just another bum." Mark exhaled slowly, steadying his temper. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He held it up between them. "You want this?" he asked the loudest one. The guy frowned. Yeah?" Without a word, Mark crumpled the bill in his hand. "Still want it?" The guy nodded. Obviously. Mark then dropped the bill onto the diner floor, stepping on it, grinding it into the dirt and dust. He picked it back up and held it out. "Still want it?" The young man hesitated before nodding again. Mark looked him straight in the eye. Exactly. No matter how beaten, dirty, or crumpled it gets, it doesn't lose its value. He turned back to David. Neither does he. The entire diner was silent. The young men shifted uncomfortably. One muttered an apology under his breath before slipping out the door. The rest quickly followed. Mark turned back to David, whose eyes were wide with disbelief. He had witnessed countless acts of cruelty, but kindness? That was rarer. Mark smiled. "How about some breakfast?" David hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'd like that." They ate together, talked. Mark learned that David had been struggling with PTSD, that he'd lost everything after returning from service. He had tried to get help, but had slipped through the cracks. One thing led to another, and he ended up on the streets. Mark listened, really listened. By the time they finished, Mark had already made a decision. He wasn't walking away. He called someone from his team and arranged for David to have a place to stay. A real place, a warm bed, food, a chance to start again. But it didn't stop there. A week later, David had a meeting with a Veterans Assistance Program. Mark had made sure of it. A month later, David had a job, a real job, a second chance. 6 months later, David stood on a stage at a charity gala, shaking Mark's hand as he was honored for his service, both past and present. And as the audience rose to their feet in applause, David looked out at the crowd, then back at the man who had believed in him when no one else did. Sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to remind someone of their worth. On that day, in that small diner, Mark Wahlberg didn't just buy a homeless veteran breakfast. He gave him back his dignity, and that changed everything. But the story didn't end there. David's journey was just beginning. With Mark's help, he enrolled in a therapy program designed specifically for veterans suffering from PTSD. For the first time in years, he was able to talk about what he had been through, to face his demons instead of running from them. Mark visited him often, sometimes just to check in, other times to bring along fellow veterans who had overcome similar struggles. Slowly but surely, David started to heal. Then one day, Mark had another idea. "What if we started something bigger?" he asked David over coffee one morning. "A program, something for guys like you who need a fresh start." David hesitated. "You mean like a shelter?" "More than that," Mark said. "A job training center, a place where veterans can learn new skills, get back on their feet, somewhere they belong." David stared at him, emotion welling in his eyes. "You really think we could do that?" Mark grinned. "I don't think. We will." And they did. 1 year later, they opened a facility dedicated to helping homeless veterans rebuild their lives. Hundreds came through its doors, each with their own story, their own battle scars. And each one found hope where they once had none. And it all started with a simple act of kindness in a small diner. Sometimes, one moment really can change everything. If you made it this far, I've got one question for you. Have you ever had a point in life where one moment changed everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you found this story worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.